Jeff Slauson here from 19 News Now at the 19 News digital desk. For those that are unfamiliar, there is an election in the state of Ohio tomorrow. You can early vote right now, and then there are going to be more than 8,000 precincts open throughout the day, featuring mostly local things. Now, there is a statewide issue that you're going to see on the ballot that is incredibly important. It is called Issue 2. Essentially what this does is this would allow for the state to continue to accept bonds and build up debt to allow for local infrastructure projects with no tax increases. Now, in a traditional government, if a local entity, a local government, let's just say the city of Cleveland for argument's sake, would want to improve a bridge or a road or things like that, and to get the money for it, they'd have to take on their own bonds, and to pay it back, you increase taxes. The way that the state of Ohio has it is the state would take the burden of those bonds and of the increase that it would cause with a tax-free notion, so any local community could improve their roads, could improve their bridges, and they're paying it at face value. They're not going to see an increase in taxes for people. Those that are for it, very much so, obviously, in the way that I just said. Those that are against don't want to see the debt continue to rise in the state. Now, I did speak with, earlier today, professor from Case Western Reserve University, Jonathan Enton. For those that watch all of our things, you have seen him multiple times, about this specifically, and also the ballot that is happening now. Why specifically the vote at this point? He breaks all of that down in great detail. A fantastic interview. Let's get to now. The way to go into this is simply Ohioans are going to be heading, we hope, to the polls tomorrow for some rather unique votes, but the top one that at least is a statewide issue is Issue 2. This can be seen as fairly confusing for some folks. If you don't mind breaking down specifically what Issue 2 is and why it matters.
Okay. Issue 2 authorizes the state to sell bonds for various infrastructure projects. We're voting on Issue 2 because the Ohio Constitution has a very strict limit on how much debt the state can take on. And so, technically speaking, Issue 2 is a constitutional amendment. There are a lot of these since 1851. A couple of dozen at least. And as I said, because of the constitutional debt limit, we have to vote to authorize these bonds, and that amends the Constitution. It doesn't override the debt limit. It simply says that we're okay, the people are okay with selling these bonds.
And the advantage and the reason for it is you sell these bonds, then it provides the opportunity for these infrastructure improvements with zero tax increase. There's a very clear yes or no kind of on this, and actually on the ballot it lists why you would vote yes or no in it. I do want to ask about that. You and I have talked very much so at depth when certain issues have come forward, and it does issue or at least explain a yes or a no on it. Explain why. Explain why on a ballot you would see a situation where they fully explain why you should or why you should not vote for an issue.
Well, the ballot doesn't actually summarize the arguments for and against. The ballot language is supposed to give people a fair and accurate summary of what's in the proposal. Now, there are separate documents where the Secretary of State's office will put out a summary of the pro and con arguments. And people are allowed to take that document with them into the polling place. But you won't see those summaries actually on the ballot. The summary you'll see on the ballot says, this is what this proposal will do. And then, are you for the amendment? Vote yes. Are you against the amendment? Vote no.
And this has been an amendment that has passed years prior. That's why we're in this situation, right?
Well, we've had a series of these things. There was an infrastructure amendment adopted about 20 years ago. It's expiring. So this is effectively a renewal, or it allows these sorts of infrastructure improvements to continue and maybe to have some additional ones.
When it comes to off-season, quote-unquote, voting, these are non-November elections, traditionally, what do we see? I mean, we understand we see a fairly strong turnout when it comes to presidential elections, and then even when it's an off year, but when it comes to ones that are like this, when it's an issue in the middle of May, do we see strong turnout?
Well, we tend not to, but let's keep in mind this is an odd numbered year, and so we generally do not have state or federal offices on the ballot in odd numbered years. We have local offices up in odd numbered years. That's why a lot of folks, when they go to the polls, as you said, they'll see only this one statewide issue. But depending on where you live, you may be voting. This is a primary election for local offices. And so you might be voting for candidates for mayor or city council or school board. You might be voting on local millages, for example, for the school district. Um, but this is the time of year when you see primary elections. So this is in that sense, it's a more or less standard date. The reason it seems so obscure is because other than the state issue, basically we're looking only at local offices. So in May of 26, we'll have primaries for federal offices, for state offices. There might be some state issue or two on the ballot as well. But this isn't a special election in the sense that the state simply pulled a date out of the air and said, this is when we want to vote on issue two. Instead, the state said, we're going to be voting for local offices at this time, so let's add the state issue now. Otherwise, this measure would not go on the ballot until the general election in November. And again, because we're talking about primarily local offices, we'd probably see a relatively lower turnout then. Now, it's entirely possible that the turnout in November, because it's the general election, it's the final election for these local offices, that turnout's likely to be higher. But as a practical matter, turnout for local elections in odd numbered years tends to be lower than the turnout in even numbered years when it's midterms for Congress, for example. Uh, and though the turnout in the midterms tends to be lower than the turnout in presidential years because that's the election that tends to generate the most public interest and enthusiasm or opposition.
It is always interesting when we do have these May, situations because typically, you mentioned this, it is more of that local feel, or it's a primary, which obviously has a lot of heat on it. I think that a lot of people didn't necessarily know that there was an election tomorrow. I don't know if you've ever gotten that, or you've gotten that feeling over the last couple of weeks leading into this. When it comes to that type of a feeling, and I can actually know from the people that I've talked to here, how dangerous, I guess, can that be when people are unaware of an election that is happening in May that is as important as issue two can be, depending on the result?
Well, the, the there are certainly concerns that if you schedule a statewide issue like issue two on an election where you're going to have a low turnout, it sometimes can be hard to tell who will actually turn out. Um, but um, there may be reasons to schedule the election on issue two now rather than in November. That's 6 months out. Um, and assuming that issue two passes, the state then has to go through a lot of steps in order to set up the sale of the bonds that issue two would authorize. And to the extent that the state wants to be able to get to work fairly quickly on the actual infrastructure improvements, it's in the state's interest to have the vote now and not 6 months out, because that just delays what they can do to do these projects that presumably you and I and the rest of the public will see at some point before too long.
Right. So get it done now, so then you can continue the process as
Right,
soon as possible. That makes total
right.
sense then. Professor, you answered all my questions here. Is there anything we didn't touch on that we should have?
Well, one thing to keep in mind, as a number of folks who've been following this have said, issue 2 has nothing to do with the controversy about whether the state is going to support the Dome Stadium proposal in Brook Park. This has nothing to do with football or professional athletics of any sort. That's a whole other question. We're talking basically about highways and things like that. We're not talking about the this Browns stadium proposal. Assuming that the legislature decides that it's going to support that project through the issuance of bonds, we may very well be back talking about that sort of thing, because presumably in order to sell those bonds, if that's the way the state is going to go, we'd have to do another constitutional amendment. Now, there's also the possibility that they won't sell bonds. Governor DeWine has proposed a different way of financing this project, but that's, as I said, that's down the road. We don't have to worry about that. Right now, tomorrow, it's all about infrastructure and whether people want to support those projects, not the Brown Stadium thing, whatever you think about that idea.
So this is on the ballot. Many people have early voted. You can vote tomorrow, of course, on this, but a very important issue nonetheless, and one that's important to understand. You don't want to get up to the ballot, as Professor Enton mentioned, and not really understand what potentially you're voting on. This is not the Browns. I think that's important. I think I'm really glad that he stressed that. This is not the Browns. We're talking infrastructure for local towns and villages that potentially could be needed. All right, much more on this and the other stories of the day coming up tonight. 19 News, 7 o'clock starts in about 8 minutes. We'll see you all over on Cleveland Zone 43.
19 News, now streaming on Samsung Smart TV. Search for channel 1035.